What's up? Happy Friday to my crew jumping on Instagram and YouTube. Hope everybody's doing well. It's happening on this awesome Friday. Hope everybody's had a good week. Again, fire away with some questions. I'm happy to answer whatever you guys have. My YouTube crew, you guys can type in the chat comment section there. Obviously, my Instagram people. I'm waving back at everybody, saying hey to everybody that I know on here. Good to see you guys again as my usual suspects. Like I said, anything fitness related, performance related, anything along those lines, I am happy to answer. And we can start us off on something good if somebody's got something. As always, waving back. I appreciate the log on and taking the time. So, all right, let's see. Let's see. I got a question on Valgus and kind of the ways to go about do that, along with a foot turnout during that overhead squat. So when you see the knee bow inside when your overhead squat assessment, there's a couple things that we have to take consideration of, right? So we typically do that overhead squat, and I know we've all probably seen the knee bow in, but what we really have to do is identify where that knee bow in is coming from. So we have to go overhead squat with modification, so elevate the heels, because that knee bow in can come from either something at the ankle, a restriction somewhere at the ankle, or it can come from something at the lumbopelvic hip complex. So we'd have to do that overhead squat with modification, and really check the box of where it's coming from. And it can also come from a little bit of both, a little bit of lower extremity, a little bit of lumbopelvic hip. But let's say we elevate the heels and the knee bow in is still there. That tells us that that knee bow in is coming from something at that lumbopelvic hip complex, right? So we'd have to go, okay, what are all the muscles that would contribute? Basically make a list of the muscles that would contribute to that knee bow in sign, so that femoral internal rotation. We tend to have our adductors in there, TFLs in that group. So those would kind of be the go-to release muscles. So I would release them, maybe do a joint mobilization at the hip, maybe do an adductor stretch or a kneeling hip flexor stretch to hit that TFL. And then we go into our activation of your glutes, basically, right? So I would do glute med, glute max would be my go-to activations there. And that's how I would address that knee bow in. It would be fairly quick and simple, maybe 10 minutes of a corrective routine. And then I'd go into that weight training program, and making sure we have, proper form, and making sure I'm not giving them some exercises that would kind of contribute to that knee bow in sign. So I'd want to make sure I give them, decent exercises that they can kind of prevent some of that from happening. So that's kind of where I would go with that one. Now, obviously, if it comes from the ankle or comes from the lower extremity dysfunction, it would be a little bit different of a treatment there. It'd be a lot of the ankle mobility work. So we'd release gastroc, release fibularis, mobilize the ankle, do some tibialis anterior, tibialis posterior activations, and then we're good, right? So that tells us that there's an ankle restriction, so we're getting some compensation there at that tibia, and that's what's causing that knees bow in. Now, hopefully that's somewhat helpful. For foot turnout, right, when we start seeing feet turn out, and whether it's 2 feet or 1 foot more than the other, again, a lot of that potentially can come from restriction at the ankle. So with feet turn out, we have to go back to like what that movement is. And when we look at that, that is actually tibial external rotation that's causing that to happen. So it can be driven by a lack of dorsiflexion, but a lot of it, so that foot turn out is tibial external rotation. So we have to think about what our tibial external rotators are. So you have biceps fem, again, TFLs in that mix, vastus lateralis kind of connects kind of on that outside portion of the of the leg. So that could all contribute to that as well. So we would do the same thing. We do the release of those muscles. We do potentially a joint mobilization of the knee, and then do our activations of VMO and maybe our tibial internal rotators and go from there. Now, if you notice one foot turn out or one knee bows in or one arm falls forward, we have to make sure we are only doing that corrective approach, the release, mobilize, lengthen, activate, integrate on the one side, right? So you don't want to do asymmetrical intervention on an asymmetrical dysfunction. So that's a great question to set us up with. I like that a lot. I'm going to jump to YouTube and I'll come back. So don't go anywhere. I got some more questions coming up. Any advice on tight teres minor guitar playing? So do an assessment, because it may not be teres minor. You might feel it there, but it may not be a muscle that you need to stretch, or that tightness feel can come from a muscle that's short, or it could come from a muscle that's lengthened. So do an assessment, see what's going on. If the arms are falling forward, or you have kind of the arm adduction component in there in that overhead squat, you got your muscles to release like lats and maybe pec major, and you might have some scapular stuff in there as well. So more than likely levator and rhomboids and pec minor, right? And then do some activations for the posterior rotator cuff, which would include infraspinatus and teres minor. So do the assessment first. Like I said, that feeling of tightness shouldn't be used as a metric or a gauge to say, oh, I feel tight, so let me stretch it. That may actually set you up for some bad stuff long term. It might kind of set you back, because if you take a muscle that's lengthened and stretch it more, you'll get a temporary relief, but that you've just made that worse. You've just made that dysfunction a little bit worse. What is my opinion on different deadlift stances for people with longer femurs than others? So I have a longer femur than most. I'm 6'9"-ish, a little bit taller than that, but that's all right. So my stance is really, again, kind of neutral stance. My feet are underneath my ASIS. Like, I want to stay in that neutral stance as best I can. I'm not going to take a wider stance unless, I wouldn't do this, but unless I was going to compete in a deadlift competition, right? That's just, I don't really want to do that, but I know people that do and love it, and that's fine. So I want to keep my feet neutral, because I want to get as much of kind of this optimal length tension in my glutes and quads, hamstrings, calf, all those muscles that are working. I want to optimize my length tension. Now, I may not be the heaviest lifter. I may not be able to do 500, 600, 700-pound deadlift, right? But I'm still getting, that maximal recruitment, because my muscles are positioned in the best possible position they can be in, right? So you have to take kind of ego out a little bit, which I know sometimes is tough, especially if you're training with, other people and whatever. So it doesn't matter that, I'm lifting a little bit less than somebody else. I'm moving that weight really, really a far distance. So kind of a lot of tension, time under tension, or stress on that muscle tissue. Now, like I said, if I was going to compete, you take that wider stance in competition, so you don't have to move that weight that high or that far, right? So it gives you a little bit of a competitive edge, right? And if that's your goal, if that's what your sport is, then you have to do that. But what's interesting, I was actually talking to somebody this week about that. Even your competitors train off season and pre-season with the Olympic lifters and the power lifters, or whatever you want to call it. They train with feet neutral, right? And then it's not until shortly prior to that competition do they start bringing their legs wider, like they're going to do in competition. So I tend to stick everybody feet underneath that ASIS, regardless of your structure. Like, there's not that big difference in structures that's really going to cause an impact in movement. So good question so far. I got some more on Instagram, and then Patrick, I'm coming to you on YouTube. Interested in trap stretching. So interesting. First of all, Kel Ray, thank you. Welcome in. Where have you been? We've been doing these for a while. No, I'm just kidding. So trap stretching, I don't do a ton. So what I've found, and Brent and I both have found that when you start throwing in trap stretches and getting people to do those stretches at home, tends to flare people up, right? So I tend to avoid the stretching or the static stretching of that. And what I do instead is when we identify there's some sort of scapular dysfunction. So if you see scapula elevates in their overhead squat, um, what I would focus on is that release of levator, release of rhomboids, maybe release of your trap. You can kind of get to the trap a little bit at like a 45-degree angle on the wall. And then what I'll do is I'll do the stretches or the release techniques. And then as a stretch, what I'll actually do is a dynamic release. So it's still a release technique, but I'm incorporating some head motion in there to kind of get a little bit of length in that muscle. So I'm not physically like stretching. I know you've seen that stuff on wherever you're physically stretching that muscle. I'm just using movement to get that muscle to kind of lengthen and shorten with pressure, almost like a pin and stretch technique for those muscles. So that's typically what I do for that upper trap and levator. Now, lower trap, mid trap, I tend not to. They tend to be underactive and lengthened, so you definitely don't want to stretch those. I'd want to focus more on the activation of those muscles. So hopefully that's helpful there, and for everybody else that's waving at me. Is there any added benefit to doing unstable loads and unstable surfaces at the same time on the same exercise? So there's like there's this fine line between unstable exercises plus unstable loads. I probably wouldn't recommend that 100%. I wouldn't do an unstable load like if you're familiar with the earthquake bar with the bands, that hold the weights and they kind of wobble all over the place. So I probably wouldn't do wobbly weights on an unstable surface. That may cause me to have a significant decrease in the load or the capacity that I can do and may not give me the best return. So I would prefer, and really what I've started to incorporate more is I've gotten away from the unstable surfaces. Really, the only thing I use now for unstable surfaces is the RX pad. I've even gotten away with away from some of like the Dyna discs and even the Bosu ball. Don't get me wrong, they could be great tools, but I've gotten away from that in my own trainings and coachings and stuff. And we primarily use the RX pad and unstable loads, that earthquake bar, the bar, with bands and kettlebells or plates that are kind of like dangling on the end. I'll do them, but I'll tend to do them separately, right? I'll do an RX pad, something in that stability phase, and then I'll do the unstable loads with something else, whatever it ends up being. So I still want to maintain, or I still want to make sure that even though I'm in the stability endurance phase, I'm still challenging my tissues with enough tension, with enough stress, with enough load that's really going to cause some significant adaptations. So I think sometimes if you combine them, the loads drop way down. It's almost like a fall off the cliff kind of thing with your capacity there. So, but you can play around. Like if you notice that, let's say I don't know, whatever exercise you're doing a shoulder press with the unstable loads, and you have 50s on 50-pound kettlebells on either side, right? And you're just repping them out, and then you stand on a RX pad and you can still manage like 45 or still manage 50, then maybe that's not terrible, right? But you're just gonna have to experiment a little bit. I know that it gets a little tricky there. Cool. Waving back at everybody. All these waves. Give me some questions. Let's see. Juju8219 complains of tight anterior tibialis and has tight calf muscles when squatting. So this is where your assessment really comes to play. So go back to your assessment. You can't have a tight calf and a tight tibialis anterior. That can't happen, right? Because one's on one side and one's on the other, and they both can't be tight. One's either going to be tight and lengthened, or the other one's going to be tight or short and lengthened. So what I would do is I do that overhead squat and see what you find, right? See what you find in their overhead squat with that lower extremity dysfunction. I think what most people have is that foot collapse, or that foot flatten, and also maybe some of that foot turn out, or an excessive forward lean that goes away when we elevate the heels. So that all tells us that there's some sort of restriction there at that ankle. And if you see that, you would need to release gastra, release fibularis, and then activate tibialis anterior. And even though they complain of tightness, right, that tightness can still be a muscle that's lengthened. Right? If you think about stretching a rubber band, right, that feels tight in your hands, but as you stretch that rubber band, it's being lengthened the whole time, and your muscles work somewhat like that. So that's something to kind of take into consideration. That would be my first bit of advice. When we have lower extremity dysfunction, your glutes tend to shut down. Really, if you have any of those signs, the feet turn out, feet flatten, excessive forward lean, all those lower extremity and lumbar-pelvic hip complex dysfunctions, glutes and TBA shut down. So that they kind of go hand in hand. So what I would recommend, if you do that assessment and you do see some ankle restriction, release gastroc, release fibularis muscles, mobilize the ankle, stretch the calf, right? That slant board stretch is great. Then do your activations of tibialis anterior, tibialis posterior, sprinkle some glutes in there, and integrate using kind of a full body movement, squat rows, work great for that. Right. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that gets to the bottom of it, and go from there. Our deadlifts, no, deadlifts do not make deadlifts are a glute exercise, right? Also quads and hamstrings and calves are in there too, to a certain degree, but deadlifts are glutes, right? Deadlifts are not a back exercise. Everybody gets mad when I say that. Don't do deadlifts on back day. Do deadlifts on leg day, right? And if you don't believe me, chop your legs off and then see if you can do a deadlift, right? Your prime mover in that deadlift is the glute max. So do that. I love Kelly Starrett, so he's a great guy and somebody that Brett and I really talk highly of and think highly of. So yeah, he's an awesome dude, and he's really cool. Advice for hypermobility, like hyperextension of the elbows and knees. Focus on stability. I actually had an email that I was going to address. One of my favorite workshop students of all time, out in France, asked me about that same thing. So hypermobility, what to do with it, what can you train? Are they safe to train in certain phases? So hopefully she listens to this after time difference kind of messes her up. But this question kind of goes for both of you. Somebody who is hypermobile, right? They have kind of a trade-off a little bit. They've got an increase in range of motion, but because of that increase in range of motion, they have a decrease in stability and control. So you get people that have, they always feel tight, number one, which they're not, right? They're not tight at all. They don't need more stretching. They need more control and stability. So the stability endurance phase would be an optimal phase to start them in. And what I would suggest is making sure that you're utilizing those, let's call it 12 to 20 reps, but make sure you're sticking to the tempos. It's a 3-2-1 tempo. So 3-second eccentric, 2-second isometric hold, 1-second concentric, controlled concentric phase. And that is going to create that stability component and that control component that they are missing, right? So, and you want to make sure that they're not forcing or going into that kind of super end range that they have, like at the elbows or the knees. You're not getting them to kind of lock their knee to the extent that they can. You want to get them to what would be a neutral, like normal leg locked position, right? So you don't want that leg kind of like bending backwards as they sometimes can do. Stick to just coming up to neutral. So that would be my first recommendation. Spend about 4 weeks or so, let's call it a month, in that phase, making sure that they focus on that controlled tempo, 3-second eccentric, 2-second isometric hold, 1-second concentric. And then we can progress them to more of that general strength / hypertrophy phase. And what we're going to get there is we can start to increase the load a little bit, right? But we still have to focus on tempos. It's a 2-second eccentric, 0-second hold, 2-second concentric tempo. And that's going to provide, again, a little bit of increased load, but also get a little bit of control in there. If you think about 2 seconds, see, I use bicep curls, but it's, 1, 2, 1, 2. Like that's still a controlled tempo that they can manage as best they can. I would eliminate a lot of the stretching out of their routine. I'd focus more so just on the release techniques. They tend not to need to be stretched, especially with whatever it is that we're dealing with assessment-wise. And yeah, they get some stiffness, or they get some potentially joint pains, back pains, very common, elbow pain, knee pain, things like that. But don't chase the pain, right? Focus on the assessment. Focus on your protocols. Make sure you're adhering by the appropriate tempos, and go from there. And I think you're going to have better success doing that than really what a lot of people do, and they just sit there and stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch, and then do something without any tempo or without any kind of programming. So that would be my advice. So hopefully that's helpful. And go from there. What's my take on the Theragun or vibration stimulus tools? I love them. I use the Hyper. So I'm a Hyper Ice fan. So the Hyper Volt is one of the kind of like the first evolution, I guess, or the first kind of brought to the market side of things with Theragun. I think Hyper Ice beat them to the punch, but whatever. They're very, very beneficial. Brent actually did a whole webinar on vibration training, or incorporating vibration into programming. So it's great for release techniques. It's great for preventing soreness post-exercise, at DOMS side of things. So I'm definitely a big fan, right? Now, I don't think you need to go out and buy a crazy expensive. Again, everybody has a specific price range that they can feel comfortable with. Don't go out and break the bank on one. They sell other versions, or I know Hyperice sells the vibration balls. They have the bigger one. They have the small one. I like the small one because you can just throw it in a backpack and you're good. But they are effective. They do work when used properly. We have courses on how to use those the correct way. It's not just jam it into somebody's leg and put it on high speed and do it until they're crying on the table. There is kind of a protocol for some of that. I do think some of those tools that are out there are too forceful or too much. So you just have to be a little bit of little mindful of that. Like I said, you can check out that webinar and the courses online. There's some great info on there, and I actually think that the introduction to vibration course is open to the public. So if you're not a member, you can still check that out and get some valuable info on there. Visit our website, right? It's up there just for you. So I think they're fantastic. And I even like giving them to my clients, like, here, take this, right? And do this, after our session or before a session or whatever, depending on how you run your programming. Give it to them. They can do it all on their own. It makes your job a little bit easier. You can still practice. Your personal trainer is still within your scope of practice. So it's pretty easy to use. Let's see. JRDN Keith, when you say that, are you saying release supporting muscles and increase the prime movers? I don't know specifically what you're talking about. What we talked about earlier, I'm saying that if you have some sort of dysfunction, I'm assuming you're talking about when I was talking about the calf stuff, or the restriction at the ankle. You're going to release gastroc, you're going to release fibularis, and you're going to activate the prime mover of dorsiflexion would be tibialis anterior. That's what we're trying to gain back. We're trying to gain back a lot of that lower extremity dysfunction is a restriction in dorsiflexion. So by releasing those plantar flexors, we're going to then activate the dorsiflexors to help regain some of that range in that ankle. If that wasn't based on that, let me know. Good to see you as well. Got anything else on YouTube that I missed? No. And let's see. If you have pain, definitely go see somebody. I can't give you all the advice that I'd want because obviously I can't do an assessment. So do your assessment, see what you find, and this goes kind of across the board when you're dealing with pain. When somebody comes in, I know I say this a lot for those of you guys that are on here all the time, but it's something that definitely needs repeating. When you have somebody or a client or a patient that comes in and says, "Hey, I have knee pain, or I have back pain, or I have shoulder pain, or I have whatever," take that info in. That's useful information, but don't just treat that whatever, right? Do your assessment and identify the dysfunctions that you see and treat the dysfunction, not the diagnosis, right? So if you have somebody who's got pain between their shoulder blades, right? You do the overhead squat. What you may find is you may find arms fall forward, scapula elevates, maybe head falls forward in their squat. Those would all be potential contributors to their obstructive dysfunction that they came in with that shoulder blade pain or whatever it is. So then go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what are the muscles that would contribute to arms fall forward, or the muscles that would contribute to scapula elevates, or the muscles that would contribute to head falling forward, and then treat them accordingly. Release the overactive, potentially do some mobilizations if you feel comfortable with that, or if you don't feel comfortable with that, then don't do mobilizations, right? Do some release techniques if appropriate, and then do your activations, and then reevaluate, right? See what changed, see if it started to get better, see if you're on the right track. And if you do all that and it's still there, that pain, that discomfort's not getting any better, it's still there, or whatever, maybe you're missing something, or maybe they do need a manipulation or a mobilization that's outside your scope of practice. So refer out to somebody and see what they see what they get, right? Maybe you need a second set of eyes on that person to optimize that outcome for them. What do you do when somebody says their wrists hurt doing push-ups? Again, that could be a mobilization or a mobility issue there. I can try a lot of things with the mobilizing that wrist, but what I found works best is just put them on those handles or dumbbells or whatever and keep them in that neutral position. Still works, all the same stuff. The muscles that you're working in that push-up are mainly at the shoulder and tricep, obviously, but being on being in that kind of neutral position is the same thing as being in that push-up position. So do whatever they feel comfortable with and go from there. Got to get back on the CPT program. Yeah, it's not too bad, right? I know there's a lot of content out there for you, but that CPT will give you lots of good things for you. And I'm waving back. Everybody's waving back at everybody. I see a lot of people that are on here on a regular basis. I appreciate you all. You guys are great. Hopefully, I'll come to a city near you and we can kind of meet up with these workshops that we have going on. Kind of go from there. I don't think I missed anybody, and that's perfect because I am out of time. So, guys, I appreciate this. This was a great conversation. You guys are awesome. I hope I answered everybody's question. But if I didn't, you can always leave it in the comment section when this goes up. I will see you guys next week. We're gonna maybe play around with some times and days. So maybe it's gonna be. We'll see. I got to check my schedule, but maybe it's Friday. Maybe it's throughout the week. We'll see. We'll see. You guys will see our advertisements up there for our Q&A. I appreciate all of you guys. Go do great things. I'll see you next week. Be good.